Throughout the annals of American folklore, few tales strike as deeply into the heart of the Wild West as the story of Billy the Kid. Revered and feared, Billy was more than an outlaw. He was a symbol. A boy who defied the law, outmaneuvered seasoned sheriffs, and became the very spirit of rebellion in the American frontier. Officially, his saga ended on a warm July night in 1881, when Sheriff Pat Garrett pulled the trigger that allegedly brought the Kid's reign to a bloody end in Fort Sumner, New Mexico. Billy was dead at the age of just 21, or so the world believed. But legends rarely die quietly. Nearly 7 decades later, an unexpected name pierced through the dusty silence of history: Brushy Bill Roberts. An elderly man from Hamilton, Texas, with sun-beaten skin and eyes that still glimmered with something untamed, walked into the public light claiming that he, not buried bones in a vanished grave, was in fact the real Billy the Kid. It was a claim that would send shockwaves through the historical community and ignite a controversy that continues to rage to this day. Brushy Bill wasn't just another storyteller seeking a few moments of fame. No, he had details. He had scars. He had memories that seemed too vivid, too aligned with the outlaw's real-life timeline to dismiss outright. But was it possible? Could this frail old man truly be the infamous gunslinger who had cheated death so long ago? In the late 1940s, Brushy Bill, known formerly as William Henry Roberts, lived a quiet life in Hico, Texas. That is, until he met William V. Morrison, a probate investigator from St. Louis, Missouri. Morrison had been interviewing Civil War veterans and other aging figures when he stumbled upon a thread that would change everything. He met Joe Hines, an old man with haunting eyes who whispered a secret. Billy the Kid never died. He was alive, living under a new name: Roberts. The investigator was skeptical at first. After all, the history books had long been closed on Billy the Kid. But something about Hines's conviction, about the way he described details of the Lincoln County War and the famous shootouts, pushed Morrison to dig deeper. When Morrison finally met Roberts, the two began a series of conversations that unraveled everything the public thought it knew about Billy the Kid. Brushy Bill didn't simply say he was Billy. He acted like him. He described battles with eerie clarity, recalled names and events from decades past, and even replicated the outlaw's famous ability to escape handcuffs. He claimed that Pat Garrett had not shot him in 1881, but had killed another man, Billy Barlow, in a tragic case of mistaken identity. According to Roberts, Garrett covered it up, eager for fame and reward. Billy the Kid, now free of pursuit, vanished into Mexico and over time rebuilt a life in secret under new names, eventually settling as Brushy Bill. But why step forward now? Why risk exposure after so many years of peace? The answer lay in a broken promise. Brushy Bill insisted that Governor Lew Wallace of New Mexico had once offered him a full pardon during the Lincoln County War in exchange for his surrender and testimony, a promise that was never fulfilled. Now, nearing the end of his life, Roberts wanted justice, not fame, not riches, just the redemption he felt was long overdue. When William V. Morrison first sat across from the wiry, weathered man in Hico, Texas, he didn't fully realize that he was about to ignite one of the most enduring controversies in Wild West history. Brushy Bill Roberts, sitting quietly with a steady gaze and a head full of stories, didn't look like a man prepared to rewrite the past. But the words he spoke would challenge more than just historical consensus. They would question truth itself. It began with a whisper. Morrison had been following up on claims made by Joe Hines, an elderly man whose life stretched all the way back to the blood-soaked era of the Lincoln County War. Hines had talked of men long gone, of battles won and lost, and of a secret he could no longer keep. Billy the Kid, the outlaw whose death was as famous as his life, had never truly died. According to Hines, the Kid lived under a new name, Brushy Bill Roberts. Hines refused to say more, but Morrison's curiosity was ignited. The trail led to Hamilton County, Texas, where an old man had lived in obscurity for decades, hiding a name that once sent chills through the American frontier. When Morrison met Roberts in 1949, their conversations began cautiously. Roberts was guarded, but not dismissive. He didn't beg to be believed. Instead, he told stories. Names flowed from his mouth, names known only to those who had lived and bled alongside Billy the Kid. He recounted incidents from the Lincoln County War with frightening accuracy, offering not just details, but context, motivation, and feeling. The way he spoke was nutty as a man retelling history. He spoke like someone who had lived it. Over time, Roberts revealed his secret. He claimed that he was, in fact, William H. Bonney, Billy the Kid himself. According to him, the night of July 14, 1881, did not end in his death, but in the death of a different man, a drifter named Billy Barlow. Pat Garrett, eager to collect the bounty and solidify his own fame, knew the man he had shot wasn't the real Kid. But it didn't matter. He had a body and the legend could be buried. And so Billy the Kid vanished into myth. Roberts detailed how he had escaped to Mexico, changed his name multiple times, and eventually found peace in Texas. He had no interest in fame, he told Morrison. He had built a life. He had lived long, loved much, and aged with dignity. But there was one wound that had never healed, the broken promise of a pardon. Back in 1879, Governor Lew Wallace had offered Billy a deal, testify in court in exchange for clemency. The Kid had upheld his end, but the pardon never came. Now, as an old man, he wanted what he believed was rightfully his. Morrison wasn't a gullible man. He was an investigator trained to spot inconsistencies and deception. But something about Brushy Bill's demeanor, his clarity, and his depth of knowledge gave him pause. To dismiss him outright would be to ignore evidence that could rewrite the legacy of one of America's most mythologized figures. Still, the world would not believe so easily. Morrison began gathering documentation, testimonies, and physical evidence to support Roberts's claim. It wouldn't be easy. Nearly 70 years had passed since Billy the Kid's supposed death. Many of the men who could have confirmed or denied Brushy Bill's story were already in their graves. Records were lost, altered, or conflicting. Public opinion was divided. To many, Billy the Kid was a dead man buried in Fort Sumner. To others, the legend lived on, now in the flesh of a fragile Texan whispering the secrets of a century. The storm was coming, and Brushy Bill, whether outlaw or imposter, would soon be at its center. As Brushy Bill Roberts peeled back the curtain of time and laid bare the memories of a life hidden beneath decades of silence, Morrison found himself standing at a crossroads between documented history and living legend. The man sitting before him was no ordinary elderly rancher. He was a vault of stories, a living archive of gunfire, betrayal, and dust-choked towns. With each conversation, the mystery deepened, and so did the possibility that America's most infamous outlaw had not died in Fort Sumner, but had instead survived to old age, haunted by a past no grave could bury. Brushy Bill spoke not with arrogance, but with a quiet conviction, as if unburdening a lifetime of secrets. He recounted the Lincoln County War with startling clarity, naming allies and enemies with precise detail. He remembered the betrayal of the Dolan faction, the backroom deals, the ambushes, and the moment-by-moment decisions that turned a boy into a wanted man. His voice cracked only when he spoke of the men he lost, Tom O'Folliard, Charlie Bowder, and others who fell one by one, hunted down like animals, while the law turned a blind eye to the corruption rotting Lincoln County from the inside out. Then came the night that changed everything, July 14, 1881. According to Brushy Bill, Pat Garrett didn't kill Billy the Kid that night. Instead, Garrett shot a man named Billy Barlow, an acquaintance who bore a passing resemblance to the outlaw. In the dim light of Pete Maxwell's room, confusion reigned. Barlow was unarmed, startled, and barely had time to speak before Garrett pulled the trigger. The sheriff, who had once been close to Billy, recognized the mistake too late, but it didn't stop him from passing the body off as the Kid. After all, the reward was waiting. The fame, the newspapers, the legacy. Garrett's decision rewrote history, Brushy Bill claimed, and in doing so allowed the real Billy the Kid to slip into the shadows of obscurity. The outlaw used the chaos to disappear across the border into Mexico, changing names like a man shedding old skin, eventually making his way back into the United States, under aliases like William Roberts and Oliver Partridge. He took jobs on ranches, kept his head down, and watched the world forget him. But time has a way of circling back. Brushy Bill's body bore the legacy of violence. Morrison, during a private examination, confirmed at least 26 scars from bullet wounds and knife cuts, injuries that aligned with the documented shootouts and close encounters Billy the Kid was said to have survived. The aging man also demonstrated an uncanny ability to escape from handcuffs, a skill the Kid was famous for. His reflexes may have slowed with age, but his instincts remained sharp. It was like watching a ghost reenact its own legend. The deeper Morrison dug, the more compelling Brushy's story became. He referenced obscure locations, obscure people, and made offhand remarks that seemed impossible for someone not connected to Billy's past to know. Still, skeptics remained, and the greatest proof, his identity, would only matter if Brushy Bill could obtain what he now wanted most, a full pardon from the state of New Mexico. For Brushy, this wasn't about clearing his name. It was about honoring a deal broken by a government that had used Billy the Kid and then discarded him. Governor Lew Wallace had offered that pardon in 1879 as part of a strategy to bring peace to Lincoln County. The Kid had agreed, risking arrest by testifying in court. But after the trial, the promise evaporated. Some say it was politics. Others say Wallace had no intention of following through. Regardless, the betrayal stuck with Billy. So much so that 70 years later, he came forward not to boast but to reclaim that stolen redemption. In 1950, Brushy Bill agreed to go public. Morrison arranged a meeting with New Mexico Governor Thomas J. Mabry, hoping to finally secure the pardon. But the encounter turned into a media spectacle. The old man, clearly nervous and in deteriorating health, was bombarded by skeptical questions. He faltered under pressure. He didn't have the polished demeanor the press expected. For those in the room that day, it was enough to dismiss him as a fraud. But Morrison saw something different. He saw a man breaking, not from deception, but from the weight of history crushing down on him one last time. Days later, Brushy Bill collapsed on a street in Hico. The heart that had carried so many secrets for so many years finally gave out. On December 27, 1950, he was dead. The man who claimed to be Billy the Kid never got his pardon, but he left behind a firestorm that refused to die. In the wake of Brushy Bill Roberts' sudden death, the tale of the old man who claimed to be Billy the Kid should have faded quietly into the dust. Instead, it did the opposite. His confession became a spark that reignited national interest in the life and supposed death of one of the most notorious figures of the Wild West. What had been dismissed in a single meeting with the governor began to echo through books, broadcasts, and historical circles, with a growing chorus of one urgent question. What if he was telling the truth? The mystery refused to die. Researchers, journalists, amateur historians, and even descendants of Billy the Kid's associates began to re-examine the case with new eyes. In a post-war America fascinated by unsolved mysteries and ghost stories from the frontier, Brushy Bill became a symbol of unresolved history. His story was too rich, too strange, and too provocative to ignore. Public attention surged again in the late 1980s when the television program Unsolved Mysteries, hosted by Robert Stack, aired a dramatic segment on Brushy Bill's claim. The episode reignited the debate and presented both the legend and the lingering questions to a national audience. Suddenly, millions of Americans were introduced to the idea that the legend of Billy the Kid might still walk among them, having died not in 1881, but in 1950. Then came Young Guns the Seku in 1990. The film portrayed Billy the Kid's story with a twist, opening with an elderly narrator recounting his youthful adventures as the real Kid. That narrator was none other than a fictionalized version of Brushy Bill Roberts. The movie didn't just entertain, it added legitimacy to a theory that had once been laughed out of the governor's office. Pop culture embraced the possibility that the outlaw's fate was still unresolved, and suddenly, Brushy Bill was being reconsidered not as a fraud, but as the gatekeeper to a deeper truth buried in the sandstorms of the Southwest. But it wasn't just Hollywood that brought the legend back to life. Science, too, was called upon. In 1990, the Advanced Imaging and Graphics Laboratory at the University of Texas launched an investigation that would add a layer of scientific intrigue to the mystery. Researchers Scott Acton and Alan Bovick were tasked with comparing photographs of the known Billy the Kid, specifically the famous Diedrich Upham tintype image, with verified photos of Brushy Bill Roberts at various stages of his life. The results stunned them. Using advanced image comparison techniques, they discovered a 93% match between a teenage photo of Brushy Bill and the iconic image of Billy the Kid. Facial structure, ear positioning, bone alignment. These markers aligned closely enough to raise eyebrows in the academic world. While not conclusive, the findings strongly suggested that the two men could very well be the same person. Critics dismissed the science, claiming that facial similarity does not equal identity, but supporters took it as the validation they had long waited for. If Brushy Bill was an imposter, he was a remarkably convincing one, down to the scars, the voice, the knowledge, and now the face. The momentum didn't stop there. Books flooded the shelves, documentaries aired, and family members of both Billy the Kid and Pat Garrett began offering contradictory testimonies. Some believed Brushy Bill's story was an embarrassment to their legacy. Others believed he was the final piece in a puzzle the state had tried to bury for decades. Then came the calls for exhumation. In the early 2000s, law enforcement officials from New Mexico, including Lincoln County Sheriff Tom Sullivan and Tobacco County Sheriff Gary Graves, made a controversial move. They sought to exhume the graves of Billy the Kid, his supposed mother Catherine Antrim, and even Brushy Bill Roberts, to settle the mystery once and for all using DNA evidence. The plan was straightforward: extract samples from the graves, compare maternal lines using mitochondrial DNA, and determine whether Brushy Bill and the man buried in Fort Sumner were one and the same. But the graves were uncooperative. The location of Billy the Kid's body had been washed away by decades of floods, and no one could confirm exactly where Catherine Antrim was buried. Legal challenges piled up. Families protested. The court eventually blocked the exhumations entirely, so the legend lived on, unconfirmed, unrefuted, and eternal. Brushy Bill Roberts died as he lived, on the edge of belief, in the liminal space between myth and man. To some he was a fraud. To others he was a wronged soul whose truth was silenced by bureaucracy and pride. But for all, he became a symbol of the enduring power of story, of the thirst for truth, and of a country still haunted by its Wild West ghosts. And as the 21st century dawned, the whispers only grew louder. As Brushy Bill Roberts rested beneath the Texas soil, his story refused to follow him into silence. If anything, death amplified his voice. In dusty archives and modern courtrooms, the question still echoed: had the most legendary outlaw in American history lived to old age and died with his secret nearly intact? The only path to definitive truth, some believed, lay buried 6 feet under, literally. The push for scientific resolution intensified in the early 2000s. Sheriff Tom Sullivan of Lincoln County, Captain Steve Cedarwall, and Tobacco County Sheriff Gary Graves were among the few bold enough to propose what many had only whispered about: unearthing the past in the most literal way. Their mission was simple in theory, but incendiary in practice: exhume the remains of Billy the Kid and his alleged mother Catherine Antrim in Fort Sumner, New Mexico, and compare their DNA with that of Brushy Bill Roberts. But the mission wasn't just about science. It was about justice. The sheriffs believed that history had been manipulated by ambition, by politics, and by those desperate to preserve a version of the past that may have never existed. Their effort wasn't just forensic, it was personal. They wanted to correct a 120-year-old wrong and restore the truth to the American mythos. Immediately they hit obstacles. The first was geography. Billy the Kid's supposed grave had been lost to time. The original burial site had no coffin, no embalming, and no solid record. It had been dug hastily in the middle of the night following a chaotic shooting. Decades later, floods had washed over the cemetery, shifting markers and rendering the exact location uncertain. The modern headstone that reads Billy the Kid sits atop a plot that many experts believe contains no actual remains. Then there was Catherine Antrim's grave, located in Silver City, New Mexico. While more identifiable than her son's, it still presented logistical and legal issues. Was she really buried there? Were her remains intact? Would the court even allow the exhumation? And finally, the grave of Brushy Bill Roberts, lying beneath a weathered headstone in Hamilton County, Texas. Of the three, his was the most accessible and best preserved. DNA could be extracted, but without a verifiable comparison to Billy the Kid or his mother, it would prove nothing. All three graves would need to be opened to close the book. The sheriffs filed formal petitions, local governments became involved, historians voiced support and outrage in equal measure. Some accused the officials of grave robbing, others claimed it was a publicity stunt. Descendants of the key players, Billy the Kid, Pat Garrett, and Brushy Bill, were divided, their families suddenly thrust back into a 19th century blood feud reanimated by 21st century science. Courtroom debates erupted, fueled by emotion and media coverage. Legal filings grew thick with affidavits, expert opinions, and public backlash. At the heart of it all stood a single question. Did the public have the right to know the truth, even if it meant disturbing the dead? In 2004, the court delivered its verdict. The request to exhume all remains was denied. The legal language was final, but the conclusion it supported was not. No DNA would be taken, no skeletons would be unearthed, no final answers would be revealed. History, for now, would remain in the shadows. For Brushy Bill's believers, the denial was another injustice added to a long list. They argued that the refusal to test the evidence spoke louder than any testimony. If there was nothing to hide, why fear the truth? For others, the court's decision was a necessary protection. Grave sites, they argued, were sacred, not laboratories. The legend of Billy the Kid had grown beyond one man. It had become a cultural myth, and myths were not meant to be dissected under microscopes. Meanwhile, books continued to sell. Podcasts emerged. New documentaries reintroduced the story to younger generations who saw in Brushy Bill a timeless theme. A man running from the past, seeking redemption in a world that no longer believed in second chances. His plea for a pardon, his dramatic collapse after the governor's rejection, and the trail of clues left behind. Each detail felt like it belonged more to literature than to law. And maybe that was the point. Brushy Bill Roberts may never be definitively proven to be Billy the Kid. DNA may remain locked in coffins the law forbids from opening. But his story lives on because it speaks to something deeper than evidence. It speaks to the possibility that we never fully know our heroes or our villains, and that sometimes the truth rides quietly through history, unrecognized and misunderstood. In the end, Brushy Bill became what Billy the Kid had always been, a symbol of the unresolved, a figure caught between pages of history and whispers of legend. As the courts silenced the shovels and sealed the graves, the controversy around Brushy Bill Roberts only grew louder in the hearts and minds of the public. What had once been a curious footnote in the Wild West legacy was now a full-blown cultural debate. On one side stood historians and skeptics, firmly rooted in the documented death of Billy the Kid at the hands of Sheriff Pat Garrett in 1881. On the other, a passionate community of believers who saw Brushy Bill not as a fraud, but as the ghost of truth long denied his redemption. For those who supported Brushy's claim, the facts painted a compelling picture. This wasn't some man off the street, clumsily impersonating a legend. Brushy Bill had scars, 26 in total, the result of bullets and blades, marking the canvas of a life shaped by violence. He had knowledge that few outsiders could have had, intimate recollections of the Lincoln County War, first-hand accounts of confrontations, the inner workings of gangs, backroom deals, betrayals, and alliances. He didn't just know Billy's story, he lived it. When Brushy recounted how Pat Garrett allegedly shot a man named Billy Barlow instead of Billy the Kid, it sent shockwaves through the mythos. That one revelation, if true, would upend nearly everything. According to Roberts, Garrett had mistaken Barlow in the dark and used the convenient accident to declare the kid dead, earning both reward money and a place in American folklore. Brushy claimed he took the opportunity to vanish, slipping quietly into Mexico and later the American South, living under aliases and moving town to town. But for the establishment there was one problem. This version of events couldn't be proven. Garrett had allies. He had recorded the event. He had his reputation, and official records backed him. The voice of a dying outlaw, even if sincere, couldn't undo the weight of institutional memory. Still, the contradiction was too powerful to ignore. Brushy's final moments with Governor Thomas J. Mabry became etched into the modern Western legend. In 1950, during a public hearing held in Santa Fe, the aging Roberts appeared before Mabry seeking a full pardon. What he received instead was ridicule. Critics laughed at the man, then 90 years old, shaking from the effects of multiple strokes, failing health and the long road behind him. He collapsed shortly after the hearing. Within weeks, he was dead. Many saw it as a symbolic execution, not by bullet, but by disbelief. But from that public humiliation rose a wave of sympathy. The image of a frail man begging for justice after a life of hiding struck a chord. To some, Brushy wasn't just an old outlaw. He was a mirror reflecting how America treats its forgotten, how it preserves its myths and discards its messy truths. The media, smelling blood and legend, latched on again. Brushy Bill appeared posthumously in history books, magazine features, radio shows, and, most memorably, in cinema. The release of Young Guns 2 reintroduced Billy the Kid's story to a new generation, using Brushy's claim as a framing device. The film opens with a dramatic scene. An old man, face weathered like the desert, claiming to be the outlaw everyone thought was long gone. It was powerful, haunting, and most importantly, it made people ask, what if? After that, the myth exploded. Tourism boomed in towns like Fort Sumner and Hamilton. The Billy the Kid Museum in Hico, Texas, leaned heavily into the Brushy Bill narrative, displaying artifacts, photographs, and offering lectures that supported his claim. Visitors from across the country arrived hoping to stand where he stood, touch what he touched, and maybe, just maybe, get closer to the truth. Historians and skeptics pushed back hard. They published detailed biographies, pieced together timelines, and dismantled inconsistencies in Brushy's version. They pointed to birth records, arrest warrants, census forms, and family Bibles. In their view, Brushy Bill Roberts was just a tired, confused man who may have believed his own story, or perhaps found comfort in pretending. But the counter-argument never erased the doubt. The lingering feeling remained. Something doesn't add up. The modern era brought even more attention through documentaries, podcasts, and internet sleuths. Entire communities formed online to debate and dissect every detail, matching photographs, analyzing audio, comparing handwriting. Each new piece of data, no matter how small, added fuel to the fire. And yet, amid all the noise, one detail stood above the rest: the pardon. Brushy Bill's final request was not fame or money. He didn't ask for a statue, nor did he want a film made in his honor. All he wanted was a pardon, a simple acknowledgement that in his eyes he had kept his word to Governor Lew Wallace in 1879, that he had surrendered under promise of mercy, only to be hunted down anyway. Whether or not he truly was Billy the Kid, that plea, soft, frail, and ignored, was the most human part of the legend. And maybe that's why his story still matters. Because in the end, the debate over Brushy Bill Roberts isn't just about history. It's about belief. It's about whether truth can survive beyond documentation and whether redemption can still be found, decades later, in dusty courthouses and forgotten graves. As the dust settled over the Texas plains and the court decisions closed the path to DNA validation, one thing became undeniably clear. Brushy Bill Roberts had done something extraordinary. Whether he was Billy the Kid or not, he had resurrected the most enduring ghost of the American West. His story, once met with laughter, now burned with a kind of solemn intensity because it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about what he represented, a final whisper from a vanishing world. By the time of his death in December 1950, Brushy Bill had become something between a man and a myth. His tale had transcended mere controversy and become an epic narrative, a symbol of how the frontier, no matter how many years pass, refuses to be buried quietly. At 90 years old, hunched with age, his eyes cloudy from strokes, he still carried himself with the stubborn grit of a man who had lived, escaped, and remembered. People didn't visit his grave just to pay respects. They came to connect with something lost. In Hamilton, Texas, The headstone etched with William H. Roberts, a.k.a. Billy the Kid, stands not as proof, but as possibility. The soil beneath it is no longer just dirt, it's sacred ground to some. To believers, this wasn't the resting place of a liar, but the exile of a legend who narrowly escaped the hangman's noose of history. That belief only grew with time. In a world drowning in information, the mystery surrounding Brushy Bill remained curiously resistant to full explanation. The more facts were added, the more the picture fractured. His supporters argued that contradictions in his story didn't disprove him. They made him human. After all, who remembers every detail of a life lived in the shadows, especially one that began in the blood and thunder of the Lincoln County War and stretched into the quiet stillness of 1950s Texas? The press began calling him the last outlaw. That name stuck. Because Brushy wasn't a T just telling his story. He was closing the final chapter of the Wild West itself. He represented the last living thread of an era that had shaped America's soul with fire and lead, with horses and dust trails. He wasn't just an old man with scars. He was a living bridge between our world and one that had ridden off into legend. Even his enemies had to admit, he made people feel something. And in an age where most stories fade in a flash, his only seemed to grow stronger. In the years following his death, the fire he lit kept burning. Museums dedicated space to his belongings. Authors who once dismissed him returned to his story with a humbler tone. Filmmakers recreated his final days, capturing that frail walk into the governor's office, the soft crack of his voice as he pleaded, not for recognition, but for dignity. It was no longer about the gunfights. It was about the soul beneath the myth. The people who had mocked him started to wonder, if he wasn't Billy the Kid, then why had he lived like one? Why the bullet scars? Why the deep knowledge of gunfighters long buried? Why the request for a pardon instead of profit? Brushy's story became the great what-if of the American West, a story teachers whispered about in classrooms, a tale campfire storytellers leaned into. Kids pointed at his picture and asked their grandparents, "Do you think he was really him?" The answer rarely came in certainty. It came in silence, in reverence, in the unspoken agreement that sometimes the greatest stories are those we'll never fully know. Even the government, decades after his death, couldn't quite shake the feeling that it might have gotten something wrong. His request for a pardon, once laughed out of the room, became a formal petition. New Mexico lawmakers discussed the idea of granting him posthumous clemency, not necessarily because they believed every word he said, but because they felt he had earned it. The sheer endurance of his story had made him part of the state's heritage. And if Billy the Kid truly had lived, if he truly had returned under a new name and tried to make things right, wasn't he that worthy of mercy? That debate continues to this day. Brushy Bill Roberts may not lie in a presidential library or have monuments erected in his name, but his legend stretches from the deserts of New Mexico to the courtrooms of Texas, from black and white photographs to digital reconstructions, and his ghost still walks through the pages of American folklore, because in the end, the Wild West didn't die with a gunshot in 1881. It didn't die in a court hearing in 1950. And it didn't die when the exhumation requests were denied in 2004. It lives on, in stories whispered in taverns, in dusty books passed down through generations, in documentaries still drawing millions of views. And perhaps most powerfully, it lives in the eyes of those who stand before a weather-worn grave in Hamilton, Texas, and whisper to themselves, maybe, just maybe. Long after Brushy Bill Roberts was laid to rest under the Texas sun, his story refused to settle into the silence of history. In fact, it only grew louder, echoing across generations like the distant crack of gunfire in a forgotten canyon. The legend of Billy the Kid had already cemented itself in the bedrock of American folklore, but Brushy's bold claim gave it something it never had before, an unfinished ending. From the very beginning, the Old West was a place of blurred lines. Between justice and vengeance, lawmen and outlaws, fact and fiction, Billy the Kid embodied that chaos. To some, he was a murderer. To others, a misunderstood youth caught in a storm of power, politics, and betrayal. When Brushy Bill stepped into the light in 1949, declaring himself that very same boy turned fugitive, he didn't just revive a tale, He gave it a soul. Suddenly, history wasn't just a list of dates and bullet wounds. It was alive, questioning, breathing. And so, the debate that began in quiet interviews and backroom meetings spilled into national consciousness. Was Brushy Bill a conman, a delusional elder seeking attention? Or was he, impossibly, the most infamous fugitive in American history, somehow having outrun time itself? In the decades that followed his death, investigators, historians, and storytellers took up the torch. They scoured records, tracked down descendants, and reanalyzed photos with 21st-century technology. The 1990s and early 2000s brought digital facial recognition, forensic studies, and long-awaited DNA comparisons. Some tests were inconclusive. Others pointed toward unsettling similarities between Brushy and the Kid, but nothing definitive ever emerged. Still, that lingering mystery only deepened the fascination, because maybe the truth wasn't meant to be a line carved in stone, but a legend written in dust, meant to be chased rather than captured. And while the truth remained elusive, the cultural impact was undeniable. Brushy's story exploded beyond dusty archives and academic circles. His name appeared in pop culture, often alongside the outlaw he claimed to be. Western films, books, and documentaries began to frame Billy the Kid's tale not as a closed case, but an ongoing mystery. That alone was enough to immortalize Brushy Bill. Because where others tried to fit history into neat timelines, Brushy shattered the mold. He introduced doubt, and with it, imagination. Tourism surged in places tied to his legend. Hico, Texas, where Brushy spent his final years, transformed into a pilgrimage site. The Billy the Kid Museum opened its doors, welcoming skeptics, believers, and those who simply wanted to walk where legends once tread. Fort Sumner, too, drew crowds eager to examine the supposed burial site of Billy the Kid, knowing that the body in the ground might belong to a stranger named Billy Barlow. Across the American Southwest, the past wasn't buried. It was branded into the earth. Even Hollywood returned to the story, most notably in Young Guns 2. The film opens with an elderly man, played by Emilio Estevez under prosthetics, claiming to be Billy the Kid. It was Brushy's moment, reimagined for the big screen, echoing his final desperate plea for truth and redemption. The movie didn't confirm his identity, but it left audiences with the same haunting question, what if? Because whether Brushy Bill Roberts was telling the truth or not, he succeeded in giving people a reason to care again. He gave the legend breath. He turned pages of dusty textbooks into something human, something tragic, something heroic. He reminded the world that maybe Billy the Kid didn't die with a bullet in a dark room in 1881, but lived, changed, aged, and died not as a villain, but as a man who'd lived through hell and walked away. That's what made the story so magnetic. It wasn't just about gunfights, escapes, or Old West drama. It was about identity, about the power of belief, about the idea that history isn't just written by the victors, it's whispered by those who refuse to be forgotten. In the final reckoning, Brushy Bill didn't need a court to validate his claim. His legacy was carved not in verdicts, but in voices. In every child who visited a museum and asked, was he really Billy the Kid? In every historian who flipped through brittle pages, hoping to find the missing clue, in every documentary viewer who stared into those faded black and white eyes and felt something stir. He became more than a man. He became a challenge to certainty, a test of how we tell stories, and a final outlaw, not of bullets and banks, but of memory. As time passed and the legend of Brushy Bill continued to ripple through books, screens, and whispered debates, the question that lingered heavier than any bullet wound was simple. Where were the bones? If Brushy Bill really had been Billy the Kid, then who was buried in that shallow grave at Fort Sumner? And if the grave held the wrong man, what did that say about history itself? The dusty plot in Fort Sumner, New Mexico, long labeled as Billy the Kid's final resting place, was always shrouded in uncertainty. When Pat Garrett gunned down his supposed nemesis in 1881, the burial had been rushed, unofficial and lacking in proper documentation. The grave wasn't marked with precision. Over time, floods washed away records, earth shifted, and any remains that might have been buried there were likely scattered or lost. To this day, even the most respected historians admit no one knows for certain what or who lies 6 feet under that cracked, weather-beaten headstone. It's a haunting mystery, and it's one that Brushy Bill's believers were desperate to solve. In 2003, a bold and ambitious plan was set into motion, one that could finally put the legend to rest. A coalition formed between lawmen, forensic experts, and determined historians. Among them were Lincoln County Sheriff Tom Sullivan, former Mayor Steve Sederwell, and Tobacco County Sheriff Gary Graves. Their mission to exhume the alleged remains of Billy the Kid and his mother, Catherine Antrim, and use modern DNA analysis to determine the truth once and for all. It was more than just a scientific operation. It was a reckoning. If DNA could be extracted and tested against known descendants, it could prove whether the man in that grave had any blood ties to Billy. And if not, then Brushy Bill Roberts might be the man history had spent over a century trying to bury twice. But as with most great Western stories, nothing would come easy. Legal red tape strangled the mission from the start. Family members protested. Courts hesitated. The location of the remains wasn't just vague, it was disputed. Some argued the bodies had already been destroyed by floods. Others claimed their exact locations had never been recorded properly to begin with. And then there was the ethical dilemma. Disturbing graves, especially on sacred land, comes with consequences, emotional, cultural, and legal. The case wound through New Mexico's court system, bogged down by procedural delays and rising political pressure. Eventually, the courts intervened and issued a definitive block. No exhumation would take place. The truth, if it ever existed in the soil, would remain buried, perhaps forever. For those hoping to validate Brushy Bill's claim, it was a devastating blow. DNA was the one piece of evidence that could rise above rumors, theories, and facial comparisons. Without it, the story remained exactly what it had always been, a legend, unconfirmed, unrefuted, suspended in limbo. But even that denial became part of the tale. Supporters of Brushy Bill used the court's ruling as further evidence that the establishment didn't want the truth revealed. Why stop an investigation if the evidence was so clear? Why keep the grave sealed if history had nothing to hide? To them, the decision wasn't closure, it was suppression, and so the legend grew stronger still. The grave at Fort Sumner, now enclosed in an iron fence with a weather-worn plaque, remains a site of quiet reverence. Tourists gather, leaving behind coins, flowers, and photos, tokens not just for the man allegedly buried there, but for the idea of Billy the Kid itself, the outlaw who cheated death, the youth who stood up to power, the ghost who might have lived long after his story was supposed to end. And in Hamilton, Texas, another grave tells a different story. The headstone of Brushy Bill Roberts stands tall and clean, marked with both names, Oliver Roberts and Billy the Kid. It too draws pilgrims, those who believe, those who question, and those who simply want to stand at the crossroads of myth and memory. 2 graves, 1 legend, a truth buried somewhere between. In the final calculation, it may not be science that settles the question. It may not be courts, DNA, or state records. Some stories aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to haunt, to challenge, to spark debate long after the dust has cleared. Brushy Bill Roberts may never be proven to be Billy the Kid, but in keeping the question alive, he did something far more powerful. He made us ask why we believe the stories we're told. He made us wonder whether history is a list of facts or a living, breathing narrative shaped by those bold enough to rewrite it. And he left us with a grave that may never speak, but somehow never stops whispering. Legends don't die, they evolve. And in the dusty trail between what was documented and what was whispered, Brushy Bill Roberts carved out his place as one of the greatest enigmas of the American West. Whether he truly was Billy the Kid or not, by the time the story reached the ears and imaginations of millions, Brushy had already become something far more enduring, a symbol, a living echo of a forgotten age, a walking question mark in a world desperate for certainties. Even in death, Brushy Bill stirred emotion and controversy. His gravestone in Hamilton County, Texas, is one of the most visited sites in the region, not because of what it proves, but because of what it dares to suggest. That maybe history got it wrong, that maybe justice wasn't served, that maybe, just maybe, the kid beat the odds and lived to tell his tale. What Brushy embodied wasn't just the myth of an outlaw reborn, it was the deeper myth of American reinvention. That no matter what your past held, no matter how many mistakes or sins haunted your trail, you could vanish into the frontier, change your name, and re-emerge decades later under the same sun, claiming a new life, a new identity, and, if your story was bold enough, a place in history. It's the same myth that built the American West, that beyond the last town, past the last ridge, a man could start over. That freedom wasn't just about land or law, it was about possibility. Brushy Bill didn't need to fire another shot to make his mark. He didn't need to ride with a gang or rob trains to grab headlines. All he had to do was say the words, "I am Billy the Kid." And the world leaned in, stunned, intrigued, skeptical, and unable to look away. Even the media couldn't resist. His story became the subject of books, debates, documentaries, and TV specials. Shows like Unsolved Mysteries and Brad Meltzer's Decoded brought new generations into the fold, drawing them into a mystery that refused to die. Museums erected exhibits, historians published volumes, and 1,000 conversations sparked around campfires and coffee tables. People debated the shape of his ears, the curve of his smile, the scars on his body. Others dissected the documents, hunting for typos, timelines, contradictions. Brushy became more than a person. He became a puzzle, passed down like a family heirloom, and the mystery is more alive than ever. Because in the information age, where everything is archived and verified, there's something thrilling about a secret that defies the facts, something romantic about the idea that the past still holds surprises, that even in our modern world of certainty, some stories escape the grasp of finality. And Brushy's tale, whether truth, hoax, or something in between, became a rebellion against historical closure. It challenged the gatekeepers of truth. It reminded us that sometimes legends outlive logic. And most of all, it gave people a new kind of outlaw to root for. Not the gunslinging killer from dime novels, but the elderly man with tired eyes, a battered body, and a story that just might change everything we thought we knew. In that way, Brushy Bill achieved what most outlaws never could. He rewrote his ending. While Billy the Kid was supposed to die in a flash of violence at age 21, Brushy lived long enough to tell the story in his own words, to plead his case, to show his scars, and to look history in the eye and say, "You didn't kill me." It's no wonder his gravestone carries both names, because in the end, it doesn't matter whether he was really Billy the Kid. It matters that he made us question what's real and what's not. It matters that his voice still echoes when we speak of justice, legend, and second chances. And it matters that buried beneath that Texas sky lies a man who changed the narrative, not with bullets, but with belief. So whether you see him as a fraud or a forgotten figure, one thing is undeniable. Brushy Bill Roberts became immortal. The grave may be silent, the courts may have closed the file, but the case of Brushy Bill Roberts, the man who claimed to be Billy the Kid, has never truly been settled, because his story now lives beyond law, beyond archives, beyond any single historian's verdict. It lives in the hearts of people who love legends, who question authority, who know that in the Wild West sometimes the myth is more powerful than the fact. In the decades since Brushy Bill's death in 1950, his legacy has expanded like a fire rolling through dry prairie. The legend of Billy the Kid has always fascinated the American imagination, but Brushy didn't just revive it, he changed it. He added a second ending to a one-chapter tale. He introduced doubt where there was certainty, and doubt in the right hands is combustible. Supporters of Brushy Bill's story remain fiercely loyal. From scholars who scrutinize facial measurements and historical timelines, to local Texans who claim Brushy was a quiet man with a past too big for words, his defenders form a growing chorus. They don't claim perfection, they claim possibility. And possibility is a powerful thing in a world tired of black and white narratives. It is no accident that Brushy Bill became a modern icon after the release of Young Guns 2 in 1990. In the film, he's the narrator of his own myth, portrayed as a tired man haunted by his past and desperate for closure. That portrayal didn't just entertain, it reignited the movement. Museums saw a spike in visits, books flew off shelves, and a new generation started asking old questions with fresh curiosity. What if the government got it wrong? What if Pat Garrett wasn't the hero but the cover-up artist? What if Billy the Kid didn't die in a dark room at Fort Sumner, but instead lived to be an old man with 26 scars and a story that needed telling? Each time those questions are asked, Brushy Bill lives again. Some historians still push back, pointing to inconsistencies in documents, contradictions in family records, and the lack of concrete proof. They argue that Brushy's claim falls apart under scrutiny, that his story was built on coincidence, wishful thinking, or even senility. But even they can't ignore the weight of what Brushy represents, a cultural need to believe in a rebel who escaped, in a truth that defies the record. And then there's the family. Descendants of Brushy Bill, those who knew him as Oliver Roberts, stand by him. They speak of a man who bore the marks of a violent youth, who spoke in guarded tones about people long buried, who seemed to carry more history than a quiet Texan ever should. They claim the man they buried wasn't just a retired drifter, but a ghost of the frontier, walking among them. And they aren't alone. Tourists still flock to his grave in Hamilton, Texas. Schoolchildren still debate his claim in classrooms. YouTubers, podcasters, and authors still dissect his story, digging for clues, hoping for that one missing piece that tips the scale. In 2003, the fight for truth was nearly revived again when a group of sheriffs, historians, and legal teams tried to push for DNA testing on both Brushy and the bones believed to belong to Billy the Kid. But legal resistance halted the operation, and the truth once again slipped beneath the surface. And yet, this is the paradox. The very fact that the test was denied, the very refusal to unearth the graves, has become fuel for the legend. What are they hiding? Ask believers. Why not settle it once and for all? Ask skeptics. In the absence of resolution, the myth only grows stronger. Brushy Bill's story is no longer a question of biology, it's a question of identity. Not just his identity, but ours. Do we still believe in second chances? Do we believe in stories that challenge the status quo? Do we accept that truth can wear different faces, and sometimes the most important stories aren't the ones in the textbooks, but the ones passed from voice to voice, generation to generation? That's what Brushy left behind. Not a smoking gun, not a written confession or a DNA test. He left behind a story strong enough to challenge history, a story whispered under Texas skies and carried across centuries. And maybe that's more powerful than any proof. When legends refuse to die, it's only natural that someone somewhere will try to dig up the truth, literally. That moment arrived in the early 2000s as a group of determined individuals launched what would become one of the most controversial and emotionally charged historical efforts in modern Western law. The attempt to exhume the body of Billy the Kid. It started with a question as old as Brushy Bill's claim itself. If we could compare his DNA to that of Billy the Kid's mother, could we finally put the mystery to rest? Simple in theory, monumental in reality. Sheriff Tom Sullivan of Lincoln County, Sheriff Gary Graves of Debaca County, and then Capitan Mayor Steve Cedarwall took the lead. These weren't random enthusiasts. These were lawmen, historians, professionals with access to the right tools, the right knowledge, and most importantly, the drive to uncover what they believed was the truth. The plan. Exhume the remains believed to be those of Billy the Kid in Fort Sumner, New Mexico, and compare them to the remains of his mother, Catherine Antrim, buried in Silver City. Alongside that, DNA from Brushy Bill Roberts would be collected and analyzed. If the tests matched, history would be rewritten. But almost from the moment the plan became public, resistance surged like a desert wind. Legal roadblocks were thrown into place. Challenges arose about the exact location of Billy's grave. The flood that had washed over Fort Sumner in the late 1800s had already raised doubts about whether any remains had even survived. The grave's markers were vague, the evidence inconclusive. Add to that the passionate voices of local residents and descendants of historical figures who saw the effort as a disturbance of sacred ground a violation of legacy, and suddenly the battle for truth had turned into a political war zone. Then the court stepped in. A New Mexico judge, citing legal ambiguities and lack of conclusive benefit, denied the exhumation requests in 2004. The plan was stopped. The graves remained untouched, and the truth, if it was ever buried there, was locked away once more under layers of time, soil, and now judicial order. For some, it was a victory of respect over curiosity. For others, it was a betrayal of justice and opportunity, because the chance to settle the mystery, scientifically once and for all, had been taken off the table. Not because it was impossible, but because someone decided it shouldn't happen. And in that moment, Brushy Bill Roberts transformed yet again from a possible historical hoax to a symbol of how power resists revision. His story now wasn't just a claim, it was a challenge, a test of how far society was willing to go to correct the past, or keep it preserved like a museum artifact, untouchable and unquestioned. It begged the question, who gets to decide what version of history is allowed to survive? Because if Brushy was wrong, let the science prove it. If he was right, then the books, the plaques, the museums, they would all need rewriting. And rewriting history is a threat to those who profit from its current version. That's why Brushy's tale has never just been about one man's identity. It's about a larger war, between narrative and evidence, between tradition and evolution, between folklore and forensic truth. The men who sought to unearth Billy's remains weren't treasure hunters, they were truth seekers. And the moment they were silenced, Brushy Bill's legacy deepened. Because legends thrive where facts are forbidden, the DNA tests never happened. But their absence became part of the story. Part of what makes this saga endlessly fascinating. It is not just about what we know, it is about what we'll never be allowed to know. And that forbidden knowledge, that locked-away evidence, it makes people lean in closer, it makes them wonder. And in the absence of bones, the myth grows stronger. Buried maybe, but never forgotten. When Brushy Bill Roberts died on December 27, 1950, the world may have thought the controversy died with him. But what the newspapers reported as a massive heart attack in Hico, Texas, was just the beginning of a deeper mystery, one that would echo through cemeteries, courthouses, and dusty archives for decades to come. Because what Morrison found when he examined Brushy's body after death wasn't just a corpse, it was a canvas of scars, a silent testimony inked in bullet holes and knife marks that no obituary could explain away. 26 wounds. That's how many confirmed injuries Brushy carried to his grave, scars from blades and bullets. They weren't accidental. They weren't from falling off a horse or ranching cattle. These were wounds of a gunfighter, of someone who had survived more than one life-or-death encounter. And in an age before modern emergency medicine, surviving even one of those wounds should have been fatal. Surviving all 26? It was unheard of. To many, this was one of the strongest pieces of evidence in Brushy's favor. Because who else but a notorious outlaw, one constantly hunted, shot at, ambushed and trapped, could accumulate a body map of that magnitude and live long enough to die of natural causes? Supporters pointed to the violence of Billy the Kid's era, to the constant bloodshed of the Lincoln County War, the skirmishes, the escapes, the gunfights in alleys and saloons. Could it be that Brushy didn't just know about these events because he read them in books, but because he bled through them? But scars alone don't tell the full story. What mattered just as much was how Brushy carried himself. Eyewitness accounts from those who met him in the 1940s and 50s describe a man who didn't behave like a hoaxer. He wasn't desperate for attention. He didn't chase reporters or seek fame. He only came forward, reluctantly, because he wanted something very specific, a pardon, not a statue, not a book deal, not money. He wanted closure. He wanted the promise made by Governor Lew Wallace in 1879 to finally be honored. Wallace, who was supposed to grant Billy the Kid immunity in exchange for testimony during the Lincoln County War, allegedly went back on his word. And Brushy Bill believed he had waited a lifetime for justice. If it was a lie, it was an awfully strange one. Why would a dying old man fight so hard? Not for wealth, but for a forgotten piece of legal mercy promised nearly a century earlier. That contradiction, is what drew Morrison to his side in the first place. And then there were the stories, the kind only someone who had lived them could recite. Brushy Bill wasn't just rattling off Wikipedia entries before Wikipedia existed. He knew the names of horses, the small towns that never made the maps, the minor players in battles no one else remembered. He had anecdotes about deputies who were never famous and shootouts no paper had covered. Cross-referencing his recollections, historians were stunned to find that many of these obscure details actually checked out. How? How could a man who was never there know what it smelled like after the kid escaped from jail in Lincoln? Or how a particular gunman chewed his tobacco before a gunfight in White Oaks? Coincidence, fabrication, or memory? Each explanation only deepens the mystery, because either Brushy was one of the greatest con men in American history, or he was exactly who he said he was. And that's what has kept his story alive. What makes this case so unique is not just the man at the center, but the lack of definitive proof against him. Historians who reject his claim often do so based on inconsistencies in birth records, family Bibles, or census documents. But even those aren't ironclad. Records from the 19th century were often poorly kept, miswritten, or lost altogether. Names were changed, aliases were used, and people simply disappeared. Especially outlaws, especially legends. And that's what Brushy became. A legend who blurred the lines between memory and myth. A man with scars instead of medals, with whispers instead of headlines, with a story that no courtroom or textbook could fully contain. And as the years pass and more evidence is debated, more documentaries are filmed, and more tourists visit his grave in Hamilton, the question remains unanswered. Because sometimes history doesn't give us neat endings. Sometimes it gives us a man with 26 scars and a name no one can agree on. And somehow that feels exactly like the Wild West. In the years following his death, Brushy Bill Roberts became more than a name on a grave. He became a lightning rod for debate, a magnet for myth-makers, and a cornerstone in the modern resurrection of Western folklore. Where history books hesitated, Hollywood marched forward. And with the release of Young Guns 2 in 1990, the story of the old man from Hico, Texas, took center stage once again, this time on the silver screen. The film opened with an older Billy the Kid, voiced and portrayed through narration as none other than Brushy Bill, recounting the events of his youth and the Lincoln County War. For the first time, a mass audience was introduced to the possibility that Billy the Kid hadn't died in 1881, but had instead lived to old age and died a forgotten man in Texas. It was a cinematic twist that pulled millions into the theory and sent curious viewers on their own personal manhunts across articles, museums, and forgotten trails. Books followed. Documentaries aired. Researchers, both amateur and professional, picked apart Morrison's notes, combed through census records, and began digital forensics on the few surviving photographs of both Billy and Brushy. The mystery didn't fade. It expanded. Suddenly people were asking, what if we were wrong this entire time? What if the outlaw survived the lawman? What truly gave Brushy E.S. tale staying power was that it fit so neatly into the cultural fabric of the American West. A land where legends outlived bullets, where truth was optional, and where survival, no matter how unlikely, was respected above all else. Brushy was rough-spoken, private, and filled with more stories than time could hold. He didn't behave like a man begging for attention. He behaved like someone who had simply seen too much and couldn't carry the weight anymore. And so, through film, television, podcasts, and grassroots folklore groups like the Billy the Kid Outlaw Gang, Brushy was reimagined, reclaimed. To many, he was Billy the Kid, not because the DNA said so, but because his story captured the essence of what Billy had become, a symbol of rebellion, of freedom, of the cracks in history where outlaws hide and resurface when we least expect. This resurrection of interest had ripple effects beyond entertainment. Towns like Hico, Texas, and Hamilton County became minor pilgrimage sites for fans, skeptics, and history buffs. Museums were built, grave sites cleaned. The tourism brought new life to places that had nearly faded into rural obscurity. Meanwhile, in Fort Sumner, where Billy the Kid was officially buried, local officials doubled down. Monuments were restored, plaques reinforced, and the fight to deny exhumation requests became even more resolute. Because now this wasn't just about a grave, it was about identity, heritage, and the economy of historical truth. And what of Brushy's old request? The pardon? Despite widespread calls for the New Mexico government to posthumously grant the clemency Brushy claimed was promised, official channels remained silent. In 2003, Governor Bill Richardson considered reopening the case, but ultimately declined, citing uncertainty and the potential to rewrite too much history. Once again, the system chose preservation over revision. But the people didn't forget. Each year, forums light up with new theories, side-by-side photo analyses and DNA arguments. New generations discover the legend and ask the same question Morrison once did in 1948. Could this man actually be Billy the Kid? And with every passing decade, the answer becomes more elusive, not because evidence fades, but because the legend becomes larger than fact. That's the curious power of the Old West. It doesn't just celebrate heroes, it immortalizes question marks. And few question marks are as compelling as Brushy Bill Roberts, a man who stood before a governor, asking not for wealth but for the truth to be recognized. A man who died before he could receive it. But perhaps in the way his story has survived, he got something just as powerful: immortality. Not carved in marble, but written in curiosity, in every person who reads his story, walks past his gravestone, or watches that old film and wonders, what if? Time has a strange way of softening edges, of turning criminals into folk heroes and whispers into myths. As the decades rolled on after the quiet death of Brushy Bill Roberts in 1950, his grave in Hamilton County, Texas, began to carry more than just a name. It carried a question, and that question has refused to die. Today, his headstone reads, William H. Roberts, a.k.a. Billy the Kid. It sits beneath the Texas sun, surrounded by dirt, wind, and curiosity. Tourists stop to take pictures, children point, elderly visitors nod slowly, as if they too once believed in ghosts. Because what's buried there isn't just a man, it's a possibility. The mystery of Brushy Bill isn't about a single claim. It's about the lines we draw between truth and legend, and whether sometimes those lines deserve to be blurred. Historians still argue. Some point to census records and family Bibles, noting discrepancies in Brushy's supposed birth date and life events. Others point to the physical scars, the photographic analysis, and the avalanche of specific knowledge that only the real Billy the Kid could have known. No piece of evidence has been able to completely close the case, and that's precisely why it continues to live. Because Brushy's tale taps into something deeper than facts. It taps into the American imagination. It's the belief that maybe, just maybe, the outlaw got away, that the system didn't win, that in a world full of broken promises, one man managed to slip through history's fingers and write his own ending. Isn't that what legends are made of? And let us not forget, Billy the Kid wasn't just a criminal, he was a symbol. To some, he was a ruthless gunslinger. To others, a boy trapped in a war between cattle barons and corrupted sheriffs. A product of his time. A rebel born in a world of shifting alliances and endless betrayals. Brushy, if he was the kid, carried all that weight into old age, through arthritis and failing vision, only to die before the truth could be vindicated. But in many ways he got the last word. Because long after the pistols fell silent and the wanted posters faded, we're still telling his story, still debating, still wondering. Brushy Bill may have been denied a pardon, but he was granted something far more elusive: relevance. He forced a modern world to look back and ask questions. He made us challenge what we think we know about identity, memory, and history. And perhaps that's what he always wanted. Not forgiveness, not fame, but simply to be remembered not as a myth, but as a man who survived it all. And now it's your turn to carry the legend forward. What do you believe? Was Brushy Bill Roberts just an old storyteller from Texas, spinning yarns to relive his youth? Or was he the last surviving echo of the wildest chapter in American history? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. What city and country are you watching from? Drop your flag and say hello. We love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring that notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into the hidden legends and mysteries of the Old West. Because the story of Billy the Kid isn't over, not as long as people like you keep it alive.